Again, thanks. And yes, let's talk about how COVID-19 disrupted clinical trials, our traditional way of thinking and doing clinical trials. And I think in many ways we'll reflect back for the better, despite COVID-19. I think all these innovations coming to the forefront will serve us across diseases and conditions going forward. So I'll start there. People can see my slides. Yeah, good. I'm just having troubles advancing. There we go. Just quick declaration. I've got no financial conflicts of interest, but I have been a investigator and steering committee member on a number of COVID-19 trials, and a couple of which I'll speak about today. So let's start with the sort of fundamental building block of what a randomized control trial is. In this case, I'll be using this throughout. It's a two-arm parallel randomized trial with a binary outcome. So an outcome such as mortality, yes or no. And essentially, we take a study population, a group of patients, and we randomize to treatment or control. We follow those patients up over an adequate follow-up period, and then we assess for their outcomes. And from there, we analyze the data after so many patients are accrued, and we have our answer of whether treatment is better than control. And this is a sort of a fundamental building block of clinical trials. Added to that is that during the data collection, so as patients are being randomized and followed, you may have an independent data safety and monitoring committee. And I mention this because it's going to come up, they're going to play a central role in COVID-19 trials. And essentially what they do is they assess the data for safety to make sure patients are safe. But they also can look at the data to see whether the treatment is having exceptional early benefit and could potentially stop the trial or recommend stopping the trial because the treatment is far superior to control. So that's essentially the building block. And these simple, and they're not so simple to do, but simple on paper, RCTs have been certainly the mainstay in determining efficacy and effectiveness in medicine for the last 50 plus years. There's four key elements of the RCT. So that's the design. What we bring into the practice of RCTs is certainly randomization, which I talked about, which is just assigning patients by the roll of chance to treatment or control. We want to conceal that randomization so we can't guess what the next patient, or we can't know what the next patient is going to get. So allocation concealment and the blinding of that concealment is very, very critical in randomized trials. We want to follow up by robust analysis, and when we're trying to show a treatment is superior, the preferred analysis follows the intention to treat principle, which essentially means that all patients randomized are analyzed according to which group they were assigned, not necessarily the treatment that they actually received. And then finally, if we can, blinding. This is the keeping of all those involved in the trial, including the patients, blinded to which treatment they received. Because if they knew what treatment they received, be it the clinicians, the patients, or the outcome assessors, they may be influenced by that assignment or knowing what they received. So with those elements and that basic architecture, the randomized control trial has become sort of the gold standard for assessing harm and benefit of an intervention. And because it minimizes bias and it creates equal or very comparable treatment and control groups because of the randomization. So that's the sort of RCT one out of the way, but it's important for the rest of the talk. Some of the disadvantages of RCTs. Well, RCTs have been criticized because of generalizability, that they don't have that external validity if the patients in that trial don't look like the patients in your clinic or at bedside. Because in the end, only a fraction of folk actually are enrolled in clinical trials, and So they may not be, again, reflective of practice. So that is one of the main criticisms of RCTs. Obviously, for smaller and medium-sized RCTs, large RCTs try to get around that by being all-inclusive and enrolling different patient types and so forth. Recruitment, I mean, these trials are hard. They're very, very time-consuming to screen patients, enroll, follow them up, collect all the data. It's a very, very time-consuming venture. And some clinicians and sites will just refuse to participate because they're not interested in trials or advancing, clinical research, and they've got other things to do, and they're, for the most part, busy clinicians. Finally, is the acceptability of randomization. This is, where patients just refuse to be entered into randomized trials because they want the autonomy of deciding with their clinicians what treatment they will receive. And then there's the administrative complexity, and this is the big one. This is what leads to number 5, the extreme costs, is the ethical, regulatory, legal obligations and responsibilities and hurdles of randomized trials is immense. Never mind the data coordination, the clinical coordination, the analytic coordination. They're very, very complex, and that leads to cost. And so that's the traditional RCT and the disadvantages of sort of the traditional RCT. Then COVID hit, and just sort of a bit putting the cart before the horse here, but 4 large observations as we reflect back, that the urgent and serious nature of COVID-19, as Dr. Fergusson and Einstein were referring to in the introduction, is a lot of people came together, a lot of communities, both on a national front or regional front, national front, and importantly, a global front. And this was across disciplines, working in different disciplines, and across numerous potential treatment options. So everybody bringing potential treatments to the table. The second is just the quick awareness by some governments and public health units in recognizing and championing the need for randomized trials. All the volumes of potential treatments out there, and not relying on anecdote or case series or even presidential decrees, is that we needed those trials to have evidence of both its efficacy and safety. The third is just the amount of funding that became available. I know, here within Canada, there were hundreds of millions of dollars being made available for clinical trials and clinical research in COVID-19, and even better when you partnered with international collaborators. And with all of that, the other big observation that I have is just the innovative trial designs that have sort of been simmering, over the years and building over the years, used in certain disciplines, especially oncology with basket and umbrella trials and so forth. They really came into the fold, and they were embraced because of their efficiency and the ability to enroll patients quickly. So I'll be touching more upon that through the rest of the talk. Again, just taking us back to the spring of 2020 and all the potential treatments that were being proposed, anti-inflammatories, anticoagulants, convalescent plasma, antibody cocktails, etc. We needed to make sense very quickly, and this just gives you a snapshot. These are the only the treatments that actually were in trials. A lot of them were in small trials back in April of 2020. So it just points to just the vast number of treatments that were being proposed. So how do we sort this out? And how do we sort this out in the urgency and seriousness of COVID-19 throughout the world? Well, it necessitated that we needed those efficient and quick designs to answer our questions, but we needed to improve upon the typical RCT architecture and design, which, as I mentioned, took forever, took a lot of money, and just wouldn't give us our answers quickly. So platform trials, which is my main focus today, is the most disruptive technology or research design. They really offered us promise. And they offered us promise because you could evaluate multiple treatment choices. You could adapt to the pandemic waves by pivoting to hotspots because they had that broad architecture. And you could also adapt to new potential treatments. So new treatments that came up as the pandemic was moving along, you could actually put into the architecture and test those treatments. So before I get into some graphics here, just the general features of a platform trial. They bring forward those can bring forward those four key elements of the RCTs: the allocation concealment, the randomization, the blinding, and the robust analysis, all in one platform, usually on a single disease. And in this case, it was COVID-19. So that's not uncommon from how trials are done. But the two innovations here are the multi-arm, meaning multi-interventions, and importantly, the multi-stage. So I'll be talking about multi-arm and I'll be talking multi-stage in the coming slides. And the multi-stage is the adaptive component to it, that with predetermined decision rules, you could drop arms because of superiority or futility, and you can also add arms as you're going, as I mentioned. So if we go back to that sort of basic building block of a two-arm parallel trial, and we put that on steroids, so to speak, we get the platform trial. So as I mentioned, there's multiple treatments, multiple arms, and then there's stages, okay? And the multiple arms, just like our simple trial, they're followed up. The outcomes are ascertained at an interim analysis, and decisions are made whether to continue with those arms or to drop those arms or potentially add new arms. And that's the stages. So the stages are at each time the data is analyzed, decisions were made. And so in this case, just a mock-up example that I had, that stage one, they had a control with 4 treatments that went through to the first analysis. And then at that analysis point, they decided that treatment 2 was highly effective, and they stopped enrollment into that arm and analyzed the data and published the data. And at the same time, they added treatment 5, okay? And then to the next stage, again, patients were continued to be follow up, they were analyzed, and at that decision point, treatment 4 was dropped because of futility, that it was not going to be an effective treatment. So why waste people's time by randomizing into that arm? So it was dropped. So again, the multi-arm and the multi-stage is what's important for platform trials. And if you didn't think that was enough, there's one more stage, there's the multi-platform trial. These are when different platform trials with the multi-arms and multi-stages can come together, and I'm going to give you an example, and compare common treatments and controls between the 3 platforms. So in this case, we could, because treatment 3 and the control groups were common to all platforms, we could harmonize and analyze and come up with answers even more efficiently and more quickly. So these platform trials and multi-platform trials were a huge driver of evidence throughout the COVID pandemic. And I just got a smattering of the main platform and multi-platform trials up here: the recovery trial, the Together principle, the solidarity trial that was funded and run by the WHO, a whole host of platform trials that made it into the mainstream, and I think that's going to be with us, and that will because they're incredibly efficient. So let's go through a couple examples. I mentioned the recovery trial. This is where a large platform that was funded and embraced in the UK. And when I say embraced, it was the government backing all hospitals within their National Health Service or the NHS to take part and enroll patients quickly so they could get answers quickly. And one of the treatments, the first treatments that was out of the gate that showed efficacy was dexamethasone. And so I'm going to take you through that example here of the recovery platform trial evaluating dexamethasone, but also because it's a platform trial, it was multi-arm, right? So as we see here in the right, they could have been randomized into dexamethasone, usual care, or 3 other active treatments, okay? In a 2 to 1 to 1 to 1 to 1 ratio, meaning that 2 patients, you had a 2 in 6 chance of being randomized into usual care, a 1 in 6 to dexamethasone, and 1 in 6 to one of the other 3 treatments. So in very quick order, they randomized over 9,000 patients, of which 6,425 were randomized to either dexamethasone, just over 2,000 patients, or the 4,300 into usual care. So they followed them up for 28 days, and their primary outcome was mortality. So that's the multi-arm, as I talked about, the multiple interventions. The multi-stage is that they had very, very adaptive decision-making. Their data safety and their independent data safety and monitoring board met around every 2 weeks as data was accruing, and made decisions that, once again, whether an arm should either stop or continue, and whether it would be stopped for futility or early benefit. And in the case of dexamethasone, the data monitoring committee met 5 times within a span of just over 2 months. So very, very regularly, and they could adapt to, again, to showing superiority or inferiority. The results, so in 3 quick months, they randomized 6,425 patients, and they showed that dexamethasone was highly effective in reducing 28-day mortality, with the number needed to treat in the mechanically ventilated population of 8. So 8 patients being treated with dexamethasone would save a life. And likewise, 25 patients with those that needed supportive oxygen therapy would save a life. If you weren't on mechanical ventilation or supportive oxygen, it was not likely not to benefit and could even be harmful. So this was key information early on in the pandemic, and easily transmissible throughout the world in terms of the impact. And in a publication in March 2021, they had estimated that over 1 million lives were saved just with that data alone. But as it was a platform trial looking at multiple interventions, they went on to show robust evidence of 9 further interventions. The trial continues today with some of those new therapies that are being proposed, but up to date, they've provided robust evidence on 9 interventions, showing 3 of which that were actually reduced mortality and have now been used in the mainstream. So just a monumental effort and having monumental impact worldwide. So that's the platform trial. I'll now just touch upon the multi-platform trial. These are 2 trials that or one multi-platform that I was involved in, both in the critical ill and the non-critically ill population, looking at the role of therapeutic heparin, which was a big deal early on in the COVID-19 pandemic, and with the thought that because of all the thrombosis and microthrombi that was being observed, that anticoagulants could help. So special thanks here to one of my former fellows, Ryan Zarechansky, providing some of the slide material. So the multi-platform here was 3 independent platform trials coming together: the ATTACK group, the REMAP-CAP group, and the Active 4A group, which is which is based in the US and funded by the NIH, all coming together and harmonizing protocols, a single protocol to evaluate the question of whether therapeutic heparin is better than usual care. So they came up with common primary and secondary outcomes as well as safety outcomes, and they set those rules for that multi-stage. So the adaptive aspect, they set the rules on superiority and futility when that data was being analyzed. So all this, they came together because they had a common purpose of having a quick answer and a quick, robust answer. So just quickly, it was a randomized, it wasn't blinded, it was open label, adaptive Bayesian trial. So the adaptive part, again, is looking at the data as it's accruing and using prior data, updating with the new data to give you probabilities for going forward. It was in all patients that were hospitalized for COVID-19. And again, we stratified into critical and non-critical ill populations. The intervention was therapeutic heparin as per hospital policy. And the control was VT prophylaxis heparin. Primary outcome was a ordinal scale. Ordinal scale of organ-free support days to day 21, so up to 3 weeks. And this combined mortality with organ support-free days. As I said, it was a Bayesian analytic framework. So the setting up those multi-stages, they had predetermined rules that they would show superiority if the odds ratio ever got greater than 1 with a very, very high probability. Again, with futility, something that with 95% probability that an odds ratio or risk ratio would be less than 1.2, they would say that was futile. And importantly, what we brought in to this design was something called response adaptive randomization, which again is one of those innovations that have been around, but really came into the forefront with platform trials. And that adapts your randomization ratios based on how effective the therapies were. So in the case of if therapeutic heparin was showing to be very, very beneficial, more patients were randomized into that arm than into the control arm. And with this framework, there is no predetermined sample size. There was for the recovery trial that I mentioned, but there certainly wasn't for the attack trial looking at anticoagulants, because we were working largely with unknowns. We didn't know event rates. We didn't know control rates. We didn't know what effects we would see. So we just adapted. The adaptive nature kept looking at the data, and it would tell us whether treatments were effective or futile. So very, very different way of thinking from traditional trials. And this is just a snapshot just to show you sort of the complexity of the 3 independent platform trials coming together, each with their own DSMB, each with their own data coordinating center. And it just shows the flow of the data, that there is an independent statistical group and analytic group that would oversee and harmonize the data and analysis for each of the independent DSMVs as well as the independent trials. So we started enrollment early, April 2020. So you can imagine, again, all of this coming together, finding the funding, which again, as I said, the funding was available, and we got enrolling in early April of 2020. And by November of 2020, we had our answer in the critically ill patients, where we showed that it did not improve survival or organ-free support or organ-free support days. And then we had our answer a couple months later in the non-critically ill, where it actually did improve survival and reduced organ-free days in the non-critically ill population. So again, very quick answers and robust evidence. But let's dissect. How am I doing for time? Yeah, let's dissect the multi-platform trials a bit further to understand advancements and the more difficult issues, as they say. So let's deal with the advancements. So as I mentioned, the value of RCTs took center stage, not from just the trialists themselves, but from funders, from governments. And I'll go into more in the next slide about that. The streamlining of trial processes for greater efficiency, the research communities coming together, and finally, just those innovations that I've talked about as well are big advancements. Again, some of those innovations were simmering. Now they've been catapulted into the center stage. So talking about governments, in the UK, I mentioned that they had funded and embraced platform trials. They put priority on 3 different platforms, one in the community, COVID in the community, one in the hospitalized population, and then another platform trial in the ICU population within the hospitalized population. And I don't expect you to read this letter here at all, but this is a very, very important letter. It went to every hospital, every hospital in the UK within the NH system, as well as all their health professionals. It was signed by the chief medical officer of each of the countries, so England, Wales, Northern Ireland, and Scotland, as well as an overall medical director for the NHS. And essentially what it said is it implored health professionals and hospitals to enroll their patients into these 3 platform trials to give us robust evidence as quickly as possible. And treating outside of these trials shouldn't happen unless it's supportive care or complementary care. So that's a big, big game changer. It's hard to comprehend in some ways, where an entire government says you need to focus your patients being enrolled into these 3 platform trials. And to produce the evidence they have, they needed that. So again, with the recovery trial, over 43,000 patients enrolled in less than just over a year. It's just remarkable. In Canada, we had a similar story with convalescent plasma. So this contrasts a bit with quite a bit with what happened in the United States. In Canada, our government said that convalescent plasma would not be released and it had to be studied. So they didn't authorize it as a treatment option. Rather, they embraced the Concord 1 trial, which was our Canadian-led trial looking at convalescent plasma versus usual care. So once again, this makes a big difference because we got our answers a lot more quickly than we would have, and it shows that to the health system that we need that robust evidence. And I believe in the U.S. that this didn't play out. That I think close to 100,000 units of or treatments of convalescent plasma were distributed because they wanted to get early promising therapies out to the communities and their patients. But that data could only be looked at in observational nature, and the subsequent clinical trials have sort of overturned those early results from observational studies. So again, at a government and public health level, they were embracing these large trials and platform trials. And while the pandemic is certainly unique, just this awareness has catapulted again in the decision makers and funders' eyes, the role that RCTs and platform RCTs can have. And I think there's a huge opportunity to integrate RCTs within our health system, both at a system, site, and disease level. So streamlining processes for greater efficiency. This is where we have simple consent and randomization, data collection, and the role of virtual care, which I'm not really going to talk about, but I know is within this session. I mean, the incredible advances that have been there with telemedicine and virtual care that apply in the research setting. So just to show you some of the streamlining in the recovery trial, so that UK platform trial, they had simple written informed consent that was easily available online to each of the health professionals and hospitals. It's essentially a one-page consent with a couple pages of info. They also had a simple web-based randomization. So if you had a patient that was ready, you just log into the system. And again, it was a simple one-page randomization, and they were allocated to treatment. In terms of data collection, they had a single online short follow-up form at 28 days, obviously looking for mortality data with a bit more data. And the rest of the data came from routine electronic medical or health records or registry data. So very, very simple, and the ability to just streamline the whole process. The third was the research communities coming together, again, using the example of the trials for anticoagulants. These are 3 independent groups that they themselves coming together was a big undertaking, each individually, but across all 3 trials from different parts of the world with different funding, with maybe even different interests in the beginning in how they thought the trial should be designed, all coming together and having harmonization across the protocol, across the DSMBs, and demonstrating the ability to do both learn and do in the face of so many unknowns during the COVID pandemic is just truly remarkable, and points to a way forward. And then just the trial innovations, what I've talked about, the growth of platform trials, the Bayes coming into the medical mainstream, if you will, because again, it's been around for a while. I think we're going to see a lot more uptake of Bayesian methods, and then novel outcome measures as well, such as I mentioned in the anticoagulant trial. Some of the more difficult issues, I'm just cognizant of time here, looking at, to me, the big one was efficacy versus effectiveness. And my observation is that I think we needed to sort of crawl before we walked, showing effectiveness. So a lot of the platform trials and a lot of the other type of randomized trials put intervention up against usual or standard care. And in the normal course of things, because COVID was a new disease, we'd want to know whether that treatment really did work in very tightly controlled and well-controlled conditions with, sort of more on a mechanistic level before taking that therapy into the mainstream and putting it against usual or standard care. And the reason for that is because when we have tightly controlled conditions, we protocolize a lot of things, and we blind. We use placebo controls, and the study crew are also blinded. And here, because of the dynamic nature of COVID-19, knowing and the sort of plethora of different interventions available, staff and patients could have acted differently. And so I think going forward, although they're efficient, it's very efficient enrolling patients into a usual care or standard care arm, because you don't have to do anything. You don't have to, prepare placebo and so forth. But there is that balance between protecting internal validity, a robust answer, versus that efficiency. And so just to give you an example, in the remdesivir trial that I pulled out, because patients weren't blinded, no use of placebo, there could be differences in how patients were treated. And here, just pulling up from the supplemental, that in terms of antibiotics and vasopressors and steroids, that there were subtle differences between the groups, and not so subtle differences. Whether this was due to their disease course or clinicians and study teams knowing what treatment they received, we'll never know, but it just points to a potential problem that would be less of a concern in a placebo-controlled trial. Yeah, and I thought we could have made use of the platform and multi-platform trials by actually having placebo arms built in, because we could have demonstrated very quickly whether they're efficacious before moving on to effectiveness. And indeed, some platform trials did. So the Together platform, which has reported some of their results, they did have placebo at each of those multi-stages and multi-looks. The second one is just interpreting these largely unfamiliar approaches and analyses. This is a different space than clinical trialists have been working in before, with the Bayesian analysis and adaptive design and the multi-arms and the multi-comparisons. And it's going to take a while to digest, and look for even more efficient and effective ways forward. So, and in fairness, we don't also truly understand p-values and hypothesis testing as well. So it goes on both sides. But I think the Bayesian approach has brought a lot to the table that we need to unpack and understand. And then finally, the dangers of dropping arms early. So the adaptive design, just like with traditional trials, you're always worried about stopping arms early for benefit, because you may, as in the first line, the trial may be futile for a primary outcome, but be potentially superior for major secondary outcomes that may be even more important to some audiences. And you also may declare an effective treatment on a primary outcome, but you have insufficient sample size to rule out any harm. So on a related note there too, who decides these superiority and futility thresholds that have a major say in the dropping and adding of treatments? And so if the independent investigators are patients involved or multiple investigators involved, it's really critical to get that right. So just to wrap up, I think platform trials have played a huge role in the COVID-19 pandemic, because they gave us quick answers, robust answers, and helped millions around the world in terms of their treatment and care. I think the efficiencies to be gained, again, from streamlined and virtual technology through enrollment and consent and follow-up, and you'll hear more about that today. Those are truly disruptive, and I think we need to harness that for all trials, not just COVID-19 trials. And we also, as I mentioned, have a real chance of integrating these platform trials in our own research areas. And for me, it's transfusion medicine, ICU, perioperative care. If we can get these platform trials integrated within the health system or hospital level, we'll be much further ahead with our evidence base. So with that, I'll stop, and thank you very much for listening.